This is Audible.
Macmillan Audio presents The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. Read for you by Daniel Henning.
This is Audible.
For those who have been with me since the beginning, look at what we've made. Thank you. 1. "Oh dear," Linus Baker said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "This is most unusual." That was an understatement. He watched in rapt wonder as an 11-year-old girl named Daisy levitated blocks of wood high above her head. The blocks spun in slow, concentric circles. Daisy frowned in concentration. The tip of her tongue stuck out between her teeth. It went on for a good minute before the blocks slowly lowered to the floor. Her level of control was astounding. "I see," Linus said, furiously scribbling on his pad of paper. They were in the master's office, a tidy room with government-issued brown carpet and old furniture. The walls were lined with terrible paintings of lemurs in various poses. The master had showed them off proudly, telling Linus painting was her passion, and that if she hadn't become the master of this specific orphanage, she'd be traveling with a circus as a lemur trainer, or even have opened up a gallery to share her artwork with the world. Linus believed the world was better off with the paintings staying in this room, but he kept the thought to himself. He wasn't there to engage in amateur art criticism. "And how often do you, make things float?" The master of the orphanage, a squat woman with frizzy hair, stepped forward. "Oh, not often at all," she said quickly. She wrung her hands, eyes darting back and forth. "Perhaps once or twice a year?" Linus coughed. "A month?" the woman amended. "Silly me. I don't know why I said a year. Slip of the tongue. Yes, once or twice a month. You know how it is. The older the children get, the more they do things." "Is that right?" Linus asked Daisy. "Oh, yes," Daisy said. "Once or twice a month and no more." She smiled beatifically at him, and Linus wondered if she'd been coached on her answers before his arrival. It wouldn't be the first time it had happened, and he doubted it'd be the last. "Of course," Linus said. They waited as his pen continued to scratch along the paper. He could feel their gazes on him, but he kept his focus on his words. Accuracy demanded attention. He was nothing but thorough, and his visit to this particular orphanage had been enlightening, to say the least. He needed to jot down as many details as he could to complete his final report once he returned to the office. The master fussed over Daisy, pulling her unruly black hair back, fixing it in place with plastic butterfly clips. Daisy was staring forlornly at her blocks on the floor, as if she wished they were levitating once more, her bushy eyebrows twitching. "Do you have control over it?" Linus asked. Before Daisy could open her mouth, the master said, "Of course she does. We'd never allow her to—" Linus held up his hand. "I would appreciate, madam, if I could hear from Daisy herself. While I have no doubt you have her best interests in mind, I find that children such as Daisy here tend to be more forthright." The master looked to speak again until Linus arched an eyebrow. She sighed as she nodded, taking a step back from Daisy. After scribbling a final note, Linus capped his pen and set it and the pad of paper back in his briefcase. He stood from his chair and crouched down before Daisy, knees groaning in protest. Daisy gnawed on her bottom lip, eyes wide. Daisy, do you have control over it? She nodded slowly. I think so. I haven't hurt anyone since I was brought here. Her mouth twisted down. Not until Marcus. I don't like hurting people. He could almost believe that. No one said you did. But sometimes we can't always control the gifts we're given. And it's not necessarily the fault of those with said gifts. That didn't seem to make her feel better. Then whose fault is it? Linus blinked. Well, I suppose there are all sorts of factors. Modern research suggests extreme emotional states can trigger instances such as yours. Sadness, anger, even happiness. Perhaps you were so happy you accidentally threw a chair at your friend Marcus? It was the reason he'd been sent here in the first place. Marcus had been seen in hospital in order to have his tail looked after. It'd been bent at an odd angle, and the hospital had reported it directly to the department in charge of magical youth, as they were required to do. The report triggered an investigation, which was why Linus had been assigned to this particular orphanage. Yes, Daisy said. That's exactly it. Marcus made me so happy when he stole my colored pencils that I accidentally threw a chair at him. I see, Linus said. Did you apologize? She looked down at her blocks again, shuffling her feet. Yes, and he said he wasn't mad. He even sharpened my pencils for me before he gave them back. He's better at it than I am. What a thoughtful thing to do, Linus said. He thought about reaching out and patting her on the shoulder, but it wasn't proper. And I know you didn't mean him any harm, not really. Perhaps in the future, we will stop and think before we let our emotions get the better of us. How does that sound? She nodded furiously. Oh yes, I promise to stop and think before I throw any more chairs with nothing but the power of my mind. Linus sighed. I don't think that's quite what I... A bell rang from somewhere deep in the old house. Biscuits! Daisy breathed before running toward the door. Only one, the master called after her. You don't want to spoil your supper. I won't, Daisy shouted back before slamming the door behind her. Linus could hear the little pitter-patter of her footsteps as she raced down the hall toward the kitchen. She will, the master muttered, slumping down in her chair behind her desk. She always does. I believe she's earned it, Linus said. She rubbed a hand over her face before eyeing him warily. Well, that's it then. You've interviewed all the children. You've inspected the house. You've seen that Marcus is doing well. And while there was the incident with the chair, Daisy obviously means no harm. He believed she was right. Marcus had seemed more interested in having Linus sign his tail cast rather than getting Daisy into any trouble. Linus had balked, telling him it wasn't his place. Marcus was disappointed, but bounced back almost immediately. Linus marveled, as he sometimes did, how resilient they all were in the face of everything. Quite. I don't suppose you'll tell me what you're going to write in your report. Linus bristled. Absolutely not. You will be provided with a copy once I've filed it, as you know. The contents will be made clear to you then, and not a moment before. Of course, the master said hastily. I didn't mean to suggest that you... I'm glad you see it my way, Linus said. And I know Daikumi will certainly be appreciative as well. He busied himself with this briefcase, rearranging the contents until he was satisfied. He closed it and snapped the locks in place. Now, unless there's anything else, I'll take my leave and bid you... The children like you. I like them, he said. I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't. That's not always how it is with others like you. She cleared her throat. Or rather, the other caseworkers. He looked at the door longingly. He'd been so close to making his escape. Clutching his briefcase in front of him like a shield, he turned back around. The master rose from her chair and walked around the desk. He took a step back, mostly out of habit. She didn't come any closer. Instead, leaned back against her desk. We've had others, she said. Have you? That's to be expected, of course, but they don't see the children, she said. Not for who they are, only for what they're capable of. They should be given a chance, as all children should. What hope would they have to be adopted if they're treated as something to be feared? The master snorted. Adopted? He narrowed his eyes. Something I said? She shook her head. No, forgive me. You're refreshing in your own way. Your optimism is contagious. I am positively a ray of sunshine, Linus said flatly. Now, if there's nothing else, I can show myself. How is it you can do what you do? She asked. She blanched as if she couldn't believe what she'd said. I don't know what you mean. Work for Daikami. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck into the collar of his shirt. It was awfully warm in the office. For the first time in a long time, he wished he were outside in the rain. And what's wrong with Daikami? She hesitated. I mean no offense. I should hope not. It's just that... She stood from her desk, arms still folded. Don't you wonder? Never, Linus said promptly. Then, about what? What happens to a place like this after you file your final report? What becomes of the children? Unless I'm called to return, I expect they continue to live as bright and happy children until they become bright and happy adults, who are still regulated by the government because of who they are. Linus felt backed into a corner. He wasn't prepared for this. I don't work for the department in charge of magical adults. If you have any concerns in that regard, I suggest you bring it up with Daikoma. I'm focused solely on the well-being of children, nothing more. The master smiled sadly. They never stay as children, Mr. Baker. They always grow up eventually. And they do so using the tools that one such as yourself provides for them, should they find themselves aging out of the orphanage without having been adopted. He took another backward step toward the door. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to catch the bus. It's a rather long trip home and I don't want to miss it. Thank you for your hospitality, and again, once the report is filed, you will be sent a copy for your own records. Do let us know if you have any questions. Actually, I do have another, submitted in writing, Linus called, already through the door. I look forward to it. He shut it behind him, the latch clicking in place. He took a deep breath before exhaling slowly. Now you've gone and done it, old boy. She'll send you hundreds of questions. I can still hear you, the master said through the door. Linus startled before hurrying down the hall. He was about to leave through the front door when he paused at a bright burst of laughter coming from the kitchen. Against his better judgment, he tiptoed toward the sound. He passed by posters nailed to the walls, the same messages that hung in all the Daikami-sanctioned orphanages he'd been to. They showed smiling children below such legends as, "We're happiest when we listen to those in charge," and "A quiet child is a healthy child," and "Who needs magic when you have your imagination?" He stuck his head in the kitchen doorway. There, sitting at a large wooden table, was a group of children. There was a boy with blue feathers growing from his arms. There was a girl who cackled like a witch. It was fitting, seeing as how that's what her file said she was. There was an older girl who could sing so seductively it brought ships crashing onto the shore. Linus had balked when he'd read that in her report. There was a Selkie, a young boy with a fur pelt resting on his shoulders. And Daisy and Marcus, of course, sitting side by side, Daisy exclaiming over his tail cast through a mouthful of biscuit. Marcus grinned at her, his face a field of rusty freckles, tail resting on the table. Linus watched as he asked her if she would draw him another picture on his cast with one of her colored pencils. She agreed immediately. "A flower," she said, "or a bug with sharp teeth and stinger." "Ooh," Marcus breathed. "The bug, you have to do the bug." Linus left them be, satisfied with what he'd seen. He made his way to the door once more. He sighed when he realized he'd forgotten his umbrella once again. Of all the... He opened the door and stepped out into the rain to begin the long journey home. Two. Mr. Baker, Linus groaned to himself. Today had been going so well, somewhat. He'd gotten a spot of orange dressing on his white dress shirt from the soggy salad he'd purchased from the commissary, a persistent stain that only smudged when he tried to rub it away. And rain was thundering on the roof overhead, with no signs of letting up anytime soon. He'd forgotten his umbrella at home yet again. But other than that, his day had been going well. Mostly. The sounds of clacking computer keys stopped around him as Miss Jenkins approached. She was a stern woman, hair pulled back so severely that it brought her unibrow up to the middle of her forehead. He wondered every now and then if she had ever smiled in her life. He thought not. Miss Jenkins was a dour woman with the disposition of an ornery snake. She was also his supervisor, and Linus Baker didn't dare cross her. He nervously pulled on the collar of his shirt as Miss Jenkins approached, weaving her way between the desks, her heels snapping against the cold stone floor. Her assistant, a despicable toad of a man named Gunther, followed close behind her, carrying a clipboard and an obscenely long pencil he used to keep tally of those who appeared to be slacking on the job. The list would be totaled at the end of the day, and demerits would be added to an ongoing weekly tally. At the end of the week, those with 5 or more demerits would have them added to their personal files. Nobody wanted that. Those whom Miss Jenkins and Gunther passed by kept their heads down, pretending to work, but Linus knew better. They were listening as best they could to find out what he'd done wrong and what his punishment would be. Possibly he'd be forced to leave early and have his pay docked, or perhaps he'd have to stay later than normal and still have his pay docked. At worst, he'd be fired, his professional life would be over, and he wouldn't have any pay to get docked ever again. He couldn't believe it was only Wednesday. And it was made worse when he realized it was actually Tuesday. He couldn't think of a single thing he'd done out of order, unless he'd gotten back a minute late from his allotted 15-minute lunch, or his last report had been unsatisfactory. His mind raced. Had he spent too long trying to get the dressing stain off? Or had there been a typo in his report? Surely not. It'd been pristine, unlike his shirt. But Miss Jenkins had a twisted look on her face, one that didn't bode well for Linus. For a room he always thought was frigid, it was now uncomfortably warm. Even though it was drafty, the miserable weather only making things worse, it did nothing to stop the sweat from trickling down the back of his neck. The green glow from the screen of his computer felt overbright, and he struggled to keep his breathing slow and even. His doctor had told him his blood pressure was too high at his last physical, and that he needed to cut the stressors from his life. Miss Jenkins was a stressor. He kept that thought to himself. His small wooden desk was almost at the center of the room, row L, desk 7, in a room comprising 26 rows with 14 desks in each row. There was barely any space between the desks. A skinny person would have no trouble getting by, but one who carried a few extra pounds around the middle, few being the operative word, of course. If they'd been allowed to have personal knickknacks on their desks, it'd probably end in disaster for someone like Linus. But seeing as how that was against the rules, he mostly ended up bumping into them with his wide hips and apologizing hastily at the glares he received. It was one of the reasons he usually waited until the room was mostly empty before he left for the day. That, and the fact he'd recently turned 40, and all he had to show for it was a tiny house, a crusty cat that would probably outlive everyone, and an ever-expanding waistline his doctor had poked and prodded with a strange amount of glee while bloviating about the wonders of dieting. Hence the soggy salad from the commissary. Hung high above them were dreadfully cheery signs proclaiming, "You are doing good work, and account for every minute of your day because a minute lost is a minute wasted." Linus hated them so. He put his hands flat on the desk to keep from digging his fingernails into his palms. Mr. Tremblay, who sat in row L, desk 6, smiled darkly at him. He was a much younger man who seemed to relish his work. "In for it now," he muttered to Linus. Miss Jenkins reached his desk, her mouth a thin line. As was her wont, she appeared to have applied her makeup rather liberally in the dark without the benefit of a mirror. The heavy rouge on her cheeks was magenta, and her lipstick looked like blood. She wore a black pantsuit, the buttons of which were closed all the way up to just under her chin. She was as thin as a dream, made up of sharp bones covered in skin stretched too tightly. Gunther, on the other hand, was as fresh-faced as Mr. Tremblay. Rumor had it he was the son of someone important, most likely extremely upper management. Though Linus didn't talk much to his co-workers, he still heard their gossipy whispers. He'd learned early on in life that if he didn't speak, people often forgot he was there or even existed. His mother had told him once when he was a child that he blended in with the paint on the wall, only memorable when one was reminded it was there at all. "Mr. Baker," Miss Jenkins said again, practically snarling his name. Gunther stood next to her, smiling down at him. It wasn't a very nice smile. His teeth were perfectly white and square, and he had dimples in his chin. He was handsome in a chilling way. The smile should have been lovely, but it didn't reach his eyes. The only times Linus could say he'd ever believe Gunther's smile were when he'd perform surprise inspections, long pencil scratching against the clipboard, marking demerit after demerit. Maybe that was it. Maybe Linus was going to get his first demerit, something he'd miraculously been able to avoid since the arrival of Gunther and his point system. He knew they were monitored constantly. There were large cameras hanging from the ceiling recording everything. If someone was caught doing something wrong, the large speaker boxes affixed to the walls would crackle to life, and there would be shouts of demerits for Row K, Desk 2, or Row Z, Desk 13. Linus had never been caught mismanaging his time. He was far too smart for that, and too fearful. Perhaps, however, not smart or fearful enough. He was going to get a demerit. Or maybe he was going to get 5 demerits, and then it would go into his personal file, a mark that would sully his 17 years of service in the department. Maybe they'd seen the dressing stain. There was a strict policy regarding professional attire. It was listed in great detail on pages 242 to 246 of the Rules and Regulations, the employee handbook for the department in charge of magical youth. Perhaps someone had seen the stain and reported him. That wouldn't surprise Linus in the slightest. And hadn't people been sacked for smaller things? Linus knew they had. "Miss Jenkins," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's nice to see you today." This was a lie. It was never nice to see Miss Jenkins. "What can I do for you?" Gunther's smile widened. Possibly 10 demerits then. The dressing was orange, after all. He wouldn't need a brown box. The only things that belonged to him were the clothes on his back and the mouse pad, a faded picture of a white sandy beach with the bluest ocean in the world. Across the top was the legend, "Don't you wish you were here?" Yes, daily. Miss Jenkins didn't seem inclined to respond to Linus's greeting. "What have you done?" she demanded, eyebrows near her hairline, which should have been physically impossible. Linus swallowed thickly. "Pardon me, but I don't think I know what you're referring to." "I find that hard to believe." "Oh, I'm sorry?" Gunther scratched something on his clipboard. He was probably giving Linus yet another demerit for the obvious sweat stains under his arms. He couldn't do anything about those now. Miss Jenkins didn't seem as if she accepted his apology. "You must have done something." She was very insistent. Perhaps he should come clean about the dressing stain. It would be like ripping off a bandage. Better to do it all at once rather than drag it out. "Yes, well, you see, I'm trying to eat healthier, a diet of sorts." Miss Jenkins frowned. A diet? Linus nodded jerkily. Doctor's orders. Carrying a bit of extra weight, are you? Gunther asked, sounding far too pleased at the idea. Linus flushed. I guess so. Gunther made a sympathetic noise. I noticed, you poor dear. Better late than never, I suppose. He tapped his own flat stomach with the edge of the clipboard. Gunther was odious. Linus kept that thought to himself. How wonderful. You have yet to answer my question, Miss Jenkins snapped. What is it you could have possibly done? Might as well get it over with. A mistake. Clumsy me, I was trying to eat the salad, but apparently kale has a mind of its own and slipped from my... I have no idea what you're prattling on about, Miss Jenkins said, leaning forward and putting her hands on his desk. Her fingernails were painted black, and she tapped them against the wood. It sounded like the rattling of bones. Stop talking! Yes, ma'am. She stared at him. His stomach twisted sharply. You've been requested, she said slowly, to attend a meeting tomorrow morning with extremely upper management. He hadn't expected that. Not in the slightest. In fact, of all the things Bedelia Jenkins could have said at this exact moment, that had been the least likely option. He blinked. Come again? She stood upright, crossing her arms underneath her breasts, gripping her elbows. I've read your reports. They're marginally adequate at best. So imagine my surprise when I received a memo that Linus Baker was being summoned. Linus felt cold. He'd never been asked to meet with extremely upper management in his entire career. The only time he'd actually seen extremely upper management was during the holidays when the luncheon occurred, and extremely upper management stood in a row at the front of the room, dishing out dried-up ham and lumpy potatoes from foil trays, grinning at each of their underlings, telling them they'd earned this fine meal for all their hard work. Of course, they had to eat it at their desks because their 15-minute lunch break had been used up by standing in line. But still, it was September. The holidays were still months away. Now, according to Miss Jenkins, they wanted him personally. He'd never heard of that happening before. It couldn't possibly mean anything good. Miss Jenkins looked as if she were waiting for a response. He didn't know what to say, so he said, Maybe there's been a mistake? A mistake, Miss Jenkins repeated. A mistake. Yes? Extremely upper management doesn't make mistakes, Gunther simpered. There was that, yes. Then, I don't know. Miss Jenkins wasn't pleased by his answer. It struck Linus then that she didn't know any more than she was telling him, and for reasons he didn't want to explore, the very idea gave him a nasty little thrill. Granted, it was tinged with unimaginable terror, but it was there nonetheless. He didn't know what kind of person that made him. Oh, Linus, his mother had told him once, it's never polite to revel in the suffering of others. What a terrible thing to do. He never allowed himself to revel. You don't know, Miss Jenkins said, sounding as if she were gearing up to strike. Perhaps you lodged a complaint of some kind? Perhaps you don't appreciate my supervisory technique and thought you could go above my head? Is that it, Mr. Baker? No, ma'am. Do you like my supervisory technique? Absolutely not. Yes. Gunther scratched his pencil along his clipboard. What exactly do you like about my supervisory technique? Miss Jenkins asked. Conundrum. Linus didn't like to lie about anything. Even little white lies caused his head to ache. And once one started lying, it became easier to do it again and again until one had to keep track of hundreds of lies. It was easier to be honest. But then there came times of great need, such as this one. And it wasn't like he had to lie. Not completely. A truth could be twisted and still resemble the truth. It's very authoritative. Her eyebrows rose to her hairline. It is, isn't it? Quite. She lifted a hand and snapped her fingers. Gunther shuffled through some of the papers on his clipboard before handing a cream-colored page over to her. She held it between two fingers, as if the thought of it touching any other part of her could cause a blistering infection. 9 o'clock sharp tomorrow, Mr. Baker. God help you if you're late. You will, of course, make up the time you missed after. On the weekend, if necessary. You aren't scheduled to be in the field for at least another week. Of course, Linus agreed quickly. She leaned forward again, dropping her voice until it was barely a whisper. And if I find out you've complained about me, I will make your life a living hell. Do you understand me, Mr. Baker? He did. Yes, ma'am. She dropped the paper on his desk. It fluttered to a corner, almost falling to the floor. He didn't dare reach out and grab it, not while she still stood above him. Then she was spinning on her heels, shouting that everyone had better be working if they knew what was good for them. Immediately, the sound of clacking keyboards resumed. Gunther still stood near his desk, staring at him strangely. Linus fidgeted in his chair. I don't know why they would ask for you, Gunther finally said, that terrible smile returning. Surely there are more suitable people. Oh, and Mr. Baker? Yes? You have a stain on your shirt. That's unacceptable. One demerit. See that it doesn't happen again. Then he turned and followed Miss Jenkins down the rows. Linus held his breath until they reached row B before he exhaled explosively. He would need to wash his shirt as soon as he got home if he had any hopes of getting the sweat stains out. He scrubbed a hand over his face, uncertain of how he was feeling. Vexed, to be sure, and most likely frightened. At the desk next to him, Mr. Tremblay wasn't even trying to hide the fact that he was craning his neck to see what was written on the page left by Miss Jenkins. Linus snatched it away, careful not to crumple the edges. Had it coming, didn't ya? Mr. Tremblay asked, sounding far too cheerful at the prospect. I wonder who my new desk neighbor will be. Linus ignored him. The green glow from his computer screen backlit the page, making the thick script of the words that much more ominous. It read, Department in charge of magical youth. Memo from extremely upper management. CC Bedelia Jenkins. Mr. Linus Baker is to report to the offices of extremely upper management at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, September 6. Alone. And that was all. Oh dear, Linus whispered. That afternoon, when the clock chimed 5, the people around Linus began to shut down their computers and pull on their coats. They chatted as they filed out of the room. Not a single person said goodnight to Linus. If anything, most stared at him as they left. Those who had been too far away to hear what Miss Jenkins had said were most likely filled in via speculative whispers around the water cooler. The rumors were probably wild and completely inaccurate. But since Linus didn't know why he'd been summoned, he couldn't argue with whatever was being said. He waited until 5:30 before he, too, began to wrap up for the day. The room was mostly empty by then, though he could still see the light on in Miss Jenkins' office at the far end. He was thankful he wouldn't have to pass by it as he left. He didn't think he could handle another face-to-face with her today. Once his computer screen was dark, he stood and lifted his coat from the back of his chair. He pulled it on, groaning when he remembered he'd left his umbrella at home. From the sound of it, the rain still hadn't let up. If he hurried, he'd still be able to make the bus. He only bumped into 6 desks in 4 different rows on his way out, but he made sure to put them back into their places. It would have to be another salad for him tonight. No dressing. He missed the bus. He saw its taillights through the rain as it rumbled down the street. The advertisement on the back of a smiling woman saying, "See something, say something, registration helps everyone." Still clear even through the rain. Of course, he muttered to himself. There would be another one in 15 minutes. He held his briefcase above his head and waited. He stepped off the bus, which had of course been 10 minutes late, at the stop a few blocks from his house. "It's a wet one out there," the driver told him. "A fine observation," Linus replied as he stepped onto the sidewalk. "Really, thank you for—" The doors snapped shut behind him, and the bus pulled away. The back right tire hit a rather large puddle, splashing up and soaking Linus's slacks up to his knees. Linus sighed and began to trudge his way home. The neighborhood was quiet, the street lamps lit and inviting, even in the cold rain. The houses were small, but the street was lined with trees covered in leaves that were beginning to change colors, the dull green fading to an even duller red and gold. There were rose bushes at 167 Lakewood that bloomed quietly. There was a dog at 193 Lakewood that yipped excitedly whenever it saw him. And 207 Lakewood had a tire swing hanging from a tree, but the children who lived there apparently thought they were far too old to use it anymore. Linus had never had a tire swing before. He'd always wanted one, but his mother had said it was far too dangerous. He turned down a smaller street, and there, sitting on the left, was 86 Hermes Way. Home. It wasn't much. It was tiny, and the back fence needed to be replaced, but it had a lovely porch where one could sit and watch the day pass by if one were so inclined. There were sunflowers in the flower bed at the front, tall things that swayed in the cool breeze, though they were closed now against the coming evening and dreary rain. It had been raining for weeks on end, mostly an uncomfortable drizzle interspersed with a tedious downpour. It wasn't much, but it belonged to Linus and no one else. He stopped at the mailbox out front and grabbed the day's mail. It looked as if it were all advertisements addressed impersonally to resident. Linus couldn't remember the last time he'd received a letter. He climbed up onto the porch and was uselessly shaking the water from his coat when his name was called from the house next door. He sighed, wondering if he could get away with pretending he hadn't heard.
"Don't you even think about it, Mr. Baker,"
she said. "I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Clapper." Edith Clapper, a woman of an undiscernible age, though he thought she'd gone past old into the fabled land of ancient, sat on her porch in her terry-cloth bathrobe, pipe lit in her hand as it usually was, smoke curling up around her bouffant. She hacked a wet cough into a tissue that probably should have been discarded an hour before.
"Your cat was in my yard again, chasing the squirrels. You know how I feel about that."
"Calliope does what she wants," he reminded her. "I have no control over her."
"Perhaps you should try,"
Mrs. Clapper snapped at him. "Right. I'll get on that immediately."
"Are you sassing me, Mr. Baker?"
"I wouldn't even dream of it." He dreamt of it often.
"I thought not. Are you in for the night?"
"Yes, Mrs. Clapper."
"No dates again, huh?"
His hand tightened around the handle of his briefcase. "No dates."
"No lucky lady friend?"
She sucked on her pipe and blew the thick smoke out her nose.
"Oh, forgive me. It must have slipped my mind. Not one for the ladies, are ya?"
It hadn't slipped her mind. "No, Mrs. Clapper."
"My grandson is an accountant. Very stable. Mostly. He does have a tendency toward rampant alcoholism, but who am I to judge his vices? Accounting is hard work. All those numbers. I'll have him call you."
"I'd prefer if you didn't," she cackled.
"Too good for him, then."
Linus spluttered. I don't have time for such things." Mrs. Clapper scoffed.
"Perhaps you should consider making time, Mr. Baker. Being alone at your age isn't healthy. I'd hate to think of what would happen if you were to blow your brains out. It'd hurt the resale value of the whole neighborhood."
"I'm not depressed." She looked him up and down.
"You aren't? Why on earth not?"
"Is there anything else, Mrs. Clapper?" Linus asked through gritted teeth. She waved a hand dismissively at him.
"Fine then, go. Put on your pajamas and that old record player of yours and dance around the living room as you do."
"I asked you to stop watching me through my window."
"Of course you did,"
she said. She sat back in her chair and stuck her pipe between her lips.
"Of course you did." "Good night, Mrs. Clapper," he called as he slid the key into the doorknob. He didn't wait for a response. He shut the door behind him and locked it tight. Calliope, a thing of evil, sat on the edge of his bed, black tail twitching as she watched him with bright green eyes. She started purring. In most cats, it would be a soothing sound. In Calliope, it indicated devious plotting involving nefarious deeds. "You aren't supposed to be in the yard next door," he scolded her as he slid out of his suit coat. She continued purring. He'd found her one day almost 10 years back, a tiny kitten under his porch, screeching as if her tail were on fire. Thankfully, it wasn't. But as soon as he'd crawled underneath the porch, she'd hissed at him, black hair on her back standing on end as she arched. Rather than waiting to get a face filled with kitten scratch fever, he'd backed quickly out and returned to his house, deciding that if he ignored her long enough, she'd move on. She hadn't. Instead, she spent most of that night yowling. He tried to sleep. She was too loud. He pulled the pillow over his head. It didn't help. Eventually, he grabbed a flashlight and a broom, bent on poking the cat until she left. She was waiting for him on the porch, sitting in front of the door. He was so surprised, he dropped the broom. She walked into his house as if she belonged, and she never left, no matter how many times Linus had threatened her. 6 months later, he'd finally given up. By then, the house was filled with toys and a litter box and little dishes with Calliope printed on the sides for her food and water. He couldn't quite be sure how it had happened, but there it was. "Mrs. Clapper will get you one day," he told her as he slid out of his wet clothes. "And I won't be here to save you. You'll be feasting on a squirrel and Okay, I don't know what she'll do, but it'll be something. And I won't feel sad in the slightest." She blinked slowly. He sighed. Fine, a little sad. He put on his pajamas, buttoning up the front. They were monogrammed with an LB on the breast, a gift from the department after 15 years of service. He'd selected them out of a catalog he'd been given on the day of. The catalog had 2 pages inside. One page was the pajamas. The second page was a candle holder. He'd selected the pajamas. He'd always wanted to own something monogrammed. He picked up the wet clothes and left the room. The loud thump behind him told him he was being followed. He dropped his soiled work garments in the washing machine and set it to soak while he made dinner. "I don't need an accountant," he told Calliope as she wound between his legs. "I have other things to think about, like tomorrow. Why is it that I must always worry about tomorrows?" He moved instinctively to the old Victrola. He flipped through the records sitting in the drawer underneath before finding the one he wanted. He slid it out of its sleeve and set it on the turntable before bringing down the needle. Soon, the Everly Brothers began to sing that all they had to do was dream. He swayed back and forth as he headed toward the kitchen. Dry food for Calliope, salad from a bag for Linus. He cheated, but just a little. A splash of dressing never hurt anyone. "Whenever I want you," he sang quietly, "all I have to do is dream." If one were to ask if Linus Baker was lonely, he would have scrunched up his face in surprise. The thought would be foreign, almost shocking, and though the smallest of lies hurt his head and made his stomach twist, there was a chance he would still say no, even though he was, and almost desperately so. And maybe part of him would believe it. He'd accepted long ago that some people, no matter how good their heart was or how much love they had to give, would always be alone. It was their lot in life, and Linus had figured out at the age of 27 that it seemed to be that way for him. Oh, there was no specific event that brought along this line of thinking. It was just that he felt dimmer than others, like he was faded in a crystal clear world. He wasn't meant to be seen. He'd accepted it back then, and now he was 40, with high blood pressure and a spare tire around his middle. Sure, there were times when he'd stare at himself in the mirror, wondering if he could see what others could not. He was pale. His dark hair was kept short and neat, though it seemed to be thinning on the top. He had lines around his mouth and eyes. His cheeks were full. The spare tire looked as if it fit on a scooter, though if he weren't careful, it turned into one that belonged on a lorry. He looked, well, he looked like most everyone else by the time they reached 40. As he ate his salad with a drop or two of dressing in his tiny kitchen in his tiny house, while the Everly brothers began to ask for little Susie to wake up, little Susie, worrying about what tomorrow would bring with extremely upper management, the thought of being lonely didn't even cross Linus Baker's mind. After all, there were people with far less than what he had. There was a roof over his head and rabbit food in his belly, and his pajamas were monogrammed. Besides, it was neither here nor there. He didn't have time to sit in silence and think such frivolous thoughts. Sometimes, silence was the loudest thing of all, and that would not do. Instead of allowing his thoughts to wander, he lifted the copy he kept at home of Rules and Regulations, all 947 pages of it, purchased for nearly $200. He had a copy at work, but it seemed right to have one for his house as well, and began to read the tiny print. Whatever tomorrow would bring, it was best to be prepared. Three. The next morning, he was early to the office by nearly 2 hours. No one else had yet arrived, most likely still tucked away safely in their beds without a care in the world. He went to his desk, sat down, and turned on his computer. The familiar green light did nothing to comfort him. He tried to get as much work done as he could, constantly aware of the clock above ticking by each and every second. The room began to fill at 8:15. Miss Jenkins arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, heels clicking on the floor. Linus slunk down in his seat, but he could feel her eyes on him. He tried to work. He really did. The green words were a blur on the screen in front of him. Even the rules and regulations couldn't calm him down. At exactly 8:45, he stood from his chair. The people in the desks around him turned and stared. He ignored them, swallowing thickly as he picked up his briefcase and walked down the rows. "Sorry," he muttered with every desk he bumped into. "Apologies. So sorry. Is it just me or are the desks getting closer together? Sorry. So sorry." Miss Jenkins stood in the doorway to her office as he left the room, Gunther beside her, scratching his long pencil on the clipboard. The offices of extremely upper management were located on the 5th floor of the department in charge of magical youth. He'd heard rumors about the 5th floor, most of them downright alarming. He'd never been there himself, but he assumed that at least some of the rumors had to be true. He was alone in the elevator as he pressed a button he never expected to, the bright gold 5. The elevator started to rise. The pit of Linus's stomach seemed to stay in the basement. It was the longest elevator ride of Linus's life, lasting at least 2 minutes. It didn't help that it stopped on the 1st floor, opened, and began to fill with people. They asked for 2 and 3 and 4, but nobody ever asked for 5. A handful got off on the 2nd floor, even more at the 3rd, and it was at the 4th that the remaining exited. They glanced back at him curiously. He tried to smile, but was sure it came off as more of a grimace. He was alone when the elevator began to rise again. By the time the doors opened on the 5th floor, he was sweating. It certainly didn't help that the elevator opened to a long, cold hallway, the floor made of stone tile, the gold sconces on the wall casting low light. At one end of the hall was the bank of elevators where he stood. At the other end was a shuttered pane of glass, next to a pair of large wooden doors. Above them was a metal sign. Extremely upper management. By appointment only. "Okay, old boy," he whispered. "You can do this." His feet didn't get the message. They remained firmly stuck to the floor. The elevator doors began to shut.
He let them. The elevator didn't move. At that moment, Linus gave very real thought to going back to the first floor, exiting the Dicamy building, and perhaps walking until he could walk no longer, just to see where he ended up. That sounded good. Instead, he pressed the 5 again. The doors opened. He coughed. It echoed down the hallway. No time for cowardice, he scolded himself quietly. Chin up. For all you know, maybe it's a promotion. A big promotion. One with higher pay, and you'll finally be able to go on that vacation you've always dreamed about. The sand on the beach. The blue of the ocean. Don't you wish you were there? He did. He wished it greatly. Linus began to walk down the hallway slowly. Rain lashed against the windows to his left. The lights in the sconces to his right flickered slightly. His loafers squeaked on the floor. He pulled at his tie. By the time he reached the opposite end of the hallway, 4 minutes had passed. According to his watch, it was 5 till 9. He tried the doors. They were locked. The window at the side of the doors had a metal grate pulled down on the inside. There was a metal plate next to it with a small button on the side. He debated briefly before pressing the button. A loud buzzer sounded on the other side of the metal grate. He waited. He could see his reflection in the window. The person staring back at him looked wide-eyed and shocked. He hastily smoothed down his hair from where it had started sticking up on the side, as it always did. It didn't do much. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, sucked in his belly. The metal grate slid up. On the other side was a bored-looking young woman snapping gum behind her bright red lips. She blew a pink bubble, and it popped before she sucked it back into her mouth. She cocked her head, blonde curls bouncing on her shoulders. "Help you?" she asked. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He cleared his throat and tried again. Yes, I have an appointment at 9. With whom? That was an interesting question. One that he didn't have an answer to. I don't quite know. Miss Bubblegum stared at him. You have an appointment, but you don't know with whom? That sounded about right. Yes. Name? Linus Baker. Cute, she said, tapping perfectly manicured fingernails against the keyboard. Linus Baker. Linus Baker. Linus. Her eyes widened. Oh, I see. Hold one moment, please. She slammed the metal grate down again. Linus blinked, unsure of what he was supposed to do. He waited. A minute passed. And then another. And then another. And then the metal grate slid back up. Ms. Bubblegum looked far more interested in him now. She leaned forward until her face was almost pressed against the glass separating them. Her breath caused the window to fog up slightly. They're waiting for you. Linus took a step back. Who is? All of them, she said as she looked him up and down. All of extremely upper management. Oh, Linus said weakly. How delightful. And we're sure it's me they want? You are Linus Baker, aren't you? He hoped so, because he didn't know how to be anyone else. I am. Another buzzer sounded, and he heard a click from the doors next to him. They swung open on silent hinges. Then yes, Mr. Baker, she told him, cheek bulging slightly from her gum. It's you they want, and I would hurry if I were you. Extremely upper management doesn't like to be kept waiting. Right, he said. How do I look? He sucked in his stomach a little farther. Like you have no idea what you're doing? She said before she slammed down the metal grate again. Linus glanced back longingly at the elevators at the other end of the hall. Don't you wish you were here? They asked him. He did, very much so. He stepped away from the window toward the open doors. Inside was a circular room with a rotunda overhead made of glass. There was a fountain in the center of the room, a stone statue of a man in a cloak, water spilling in a continuous stream from his outstretched hands. He was looking toward the ceiling with cold, gray eyes. Around him, clutching at his legs, were little stone children, water splashing on the tops of their heads.
A door opened to Linus's right. Ms. Bubblegum stepped out from her booth. She smoothed down her dress, snapping her gum loudly. "You're shorter than you look through glass," she told him. Linus didn't know how to respond to that, so he said nothing at all. She sighed. "Follow me, please." She moved like a bird, her steps tiny and quick. She was halfway across the room before she looked back at him. "That wasn't a suggestion." "Right," Linus said, nearly tripping over his own feet as he hurried to catch up with her. "Apologies, I've never been here before." "Obviously." He thought he was being insulted, but he couldn't figure out how. "Are they all of them?" "Odd, isn't it?" She blew another bubble, which popped daintily. "And for you, of all people. I didn't know you existed until this moment." "I get that a lot." "I can't imagine why." "Yes, definitely insulted." "What are they like? I've only seen them when they serve me lumpy potatoes." Miss Bubblegum stopped abruptly and turned to look back at him over her shoulder. Linus thought she could probably spin her head all the way around if she put her mind to it. "Lumpy potatoes?" "For the holiday luncheon?" "I make those potatoes. From scratch." Linus blanched. "Well, it's a matter of taste. I'm sure you—" Miss Bubblegum harumphed and moved forward again. Linus wasn't off to a good start. They reached another door on the other side of the rotunda. It was black, with a gold nameplate fastened near the top. The plate was blank. Miss Bubblegum reached up and tapped a fingernail against the door 3 times. There was a beat, and then another, and then the door swung open slowly. It was dark inside, pitch black, even. Miss Bubblegum stepped to the side as she turned to face him. "After you." He peered into the darkness. Well, perhaps we could reschedule. I'm very busy, as I'm sure you know. I've many reports to complete." "Enter, Mr. Baker," a voice boomed through the open doorway. Ms. Bubblegum smiled. Linus reached up and wiped his brow. He almost dropped his briefcase. "I suppose I shall enter, then." "Looks like," Miss Bubblegum said. And he did just that. He should have been expecting the door to slam shut behind him, but he was still startled, nearly jumping out of his skin. He held his briefcase against his chest as if it could protect him. It was disorienting being in the dark, and he was sure this was a trap, and he would spend the rest of his days wandering around sightlessly. It would almost be as bad as getting sacked. But then lights began to shine at his feet, illuminating a pathway before him. They were soft and yellow, like a brick road. He took a tentative step away from the door. When he didn't trip over anything, he took another. The lights led him much farther than he expected, before forming a circle at his feet. He stopped, unsure of where he was supposed to go. He hoped he wouldn't need to flee anything terrible. Another light, this one much brighter, flicked on overhead. Linus looked up, squinting against it. It looked like a spotlight, shining down on him. "You may set down your briefcase," a deep voice said from somewhere above him. "That's quite all right," Linus said, clutching it tightly. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, more lights began to glow above him, shining up into the faces of 4 people that Linus recognized as extremely upper management. They were seated far above Linus at the top of a large stone wall, peering down from their perches, with varying expressions of interest. There were 3 men and 1 woman, and though Linus had learned their names early on in his career at Dicamy, for the life of him, he couldn't remember them presently. His mind had come to the decision that it was experiencing technical difficulties and was broadcasting nothing but fuzzy snow. He looked at each of them, beginning left to right, nodding as he did so while trying to keep his expression neutral. The woman's hair was cut into a petite bob, and she wore a large brooch in the shape of a beetle, the carapace iridescent. One of the men was balding, his jowls hanging off his face. He sniffled into a kerchief, clearing his throat of what sounded like quite a bit of phlegm. The second man was rail thin. Linus thought he would disappear if he turned sideways. He wore spectacles far too large for his face, the lenses shaped like half moons. The last man was younger than the others, possibly around Linus's age, though it was hard to tell. His hair was wavy, and he was intimidatingly handsome. Linus recognized him almost immediately as the one who always served the dried-out ham with a smile. He was the one who spoke first. "Thank you for taking this meeting, Mr. Baker." Linus's mouth felt dry. He licked his lips. "You're welcome?" The woman leaned forward. "Your personnel file says you've been employed in the department for 17 years. Yes, ma'am. And in all that time, you've maintained your current position. Yes, ma'am. Why is that? Because he had no prospects for anything else and no desire for supervision. I enjoy the work I do? Do you? She asked, cocking her head. Yes. Why? I'm a caseworker, he said, fingers slipping slightly on his briefcase. I don't know that there is a more important position. His eyes widened. Other than what you do, of course, I wouldn't presume to think. The bespectacled man shuffled through papers in front of him. I have here your last 6 reports, Mr. Baker. Do you want to know what I see? No, Linus didn't. Please. I see someone who is very thorough, no nonsense, clinical to a startling degree. Linus wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not. It certainly didn't sound like one. A caseworker must maintain a degree of separation, he recited dutifully. Jowls sniffed. Is that so? Where's that from? It sounds familiar. It's from Rules and Regulations, Handsome said. And I should hope you recognize it. You wrote most of it. Jowls blew his nose into his kerchief. Indeed, I knew that. Why is it important to maintain a degree of separation? The woman asked, still staring down at him. Because it wouldn't do to get attached to the children I work with, Linus said. I'm there to make sure the orphanages I inspect are kept in tip-top shape, and nothing more. Their welfare is important, but as a whole, individual interaction is frowned upon. It could color my perception. But you do interview the children, Handsome said. Yes, Linus agreed. I do, but one can be professional while dealing with magical youth. Have you ever recommended the closing of an orphanage in your 17 years, Mr. Baker? The bespectacled man asked. They had to already know the answer. Yes, 5 times. Why? The environments weren't safe. So, you do care. Linus was getting flustered. I never said I didn't. I merely do what is required of me. There's a difference between forming attachments and being empathetic. These children, they have no one else. It's the reason they're in the orphanages to begin with. They shouldn't have to lay their heads down at night with an empty stomach or worry about being worked to the bone. Just because these orphans must be kept separate from normal children doesn't mean they should be treated any differently. All children, no matter their disposition or what they're capable of, must be protected regardless of the cost. Jowls coughed wetly. Do you really think so? Yes. And what became of the children in the orphanages you closed? Linus blinked. That's a matter for supervision. I make my recommendation, and the supervisor handles what comes next. Most likely they're placed in the schools that Dicamy runs. Handsome sat back in his chair. He looked at the others around him. He's perfect. I agree, Jowls said. There's really no other choice for something so sensitive. The bespectacled man stared down at Linus. Do you understand discretion, Mr. Baker? Linus felt insulted. I work with classified youth on a daily basis, he retorted more sharply than he intended. I'm a vault. Nothing gets out. And it appears nothing gets in, the woman said. He'll do. Forgive me, but might I ask what exactly you're talking about? I'll do for what? Handsome rubbed a hand over his face.
What is said next doesn't leave this room, Mr. Baker. Do you understand? This is classified level 4. Linus took in a stuttering breath. Classified level 4 was the highest classification. He'd known it existed in theory, but was unaware that it was actually in use. He'd only had a classified level 3 case once before, and it had been most troubling. There'd been a girl in an orphanage who had turned out to be a banshee, a herald of death. Dykamy had been summoned once she started telling all of the other children they were going to die. The problem turned out to be, of course, that she'd been right. The master of the orphanage had decided to use the children as part of a pagan sacrifice. Linus had barely escaped with the children and his life. He'd been given a 2-day vacation after that one, the most time off he'd had in years. "Why me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because there's really no one else we can trust," the woman said simply. That should have filled Linus with a sense of pride. Instead, he felt nothing but dread curling in his stomach.
"Think of this as more of a checkup,"
the bespectacled man said.
"We haven't received word of any wrongdoing, but the orphanage you'll be going to it's special, Mr. Baker. The orphanage is non-traditional, and the 6 children who live there are different than anything else you've seen before. Some more than others. They're problematic."
Problematic? What's that supposed to? "Your job will be to make sure everything is on the up and up," Handsome said, a small smile on his face. "It's important, you see. The master of this specific orphanage, one Arthur Parnassus, is certainly qualified, but we have concerns. The 6 children are of the more extreme variety, and we must make sure that Mr. Parnassus continues to be capable of managing them. One would be a handful, but 6 of them?" Linus racked his brain. He was sure he'd heard of all of the masters in the region, but "I've never heard of Mr. Parnassus."
"No, I don't suppose you have," the woman said. "But that's why it's classified level 4. If you had, it would mean we had a leak. We don't do well with leaks, Mr. Baker. Is that understood? Leaks need to be plugged. Swiftly."
Yes, he said hastily. "Of course, I would never—"
"Of course you wouldn't,"
Jowls said.
"It's part of the reason why you were chosen. 1 month, Mr. Baker. You will spend 1 month on the island where the orphanage is located. We will expect weekly reports. Anything that raises alarms must be reported immediately."
Linus felt his eyes bulge. "A month? I can't leave for a month. I've duties."
"Your current caseload will be reassigned,"
the bespectacled man said.
"In fact, it's already being done."
He flipped to another paper.
"And it says here you're quite alone. No spouse, no children, no one to miss you if you had to leave for an extended length of time."
That stung more than it should have. He was aware of such things, of course, but to have them so blatantly laid bare caused his heart to stutter. But still. "I have a cat," Handsome snorted. "Cats are solitary creatures, Mr. Baker. I'm sure it won't even know you're gone."
"Your reports will be directed to extremely upper management," the woman said. "They will be overseen by Mr. Werner, though we will all be involved."
She nodded toward Handsome.
"And we expect him to be as thorough as the ones you've done in the past. In fact, we insist upon it. More so, if you deem necessary."
"Miss Jenkins, we'll be informed of your special assignment," Handsome, Mr. Werner, assured him. "Though the details will be kept at a minimum. Think of this as a promotion, Mr. Baker. One that I believe is a long time in coming." "Don't I have a say in this?" "Think of this as a mandatory promotion," Mr. Werner corrected. "We expect big things from you, and who knows where this could lead for you if it all goes well? Please don't let us down. Now, feel free to take the rest of the day to get your affairs in order. Your train leaves tomorrow, bright and early. Do you have any questions?" Dozens. He had dozens of questions. "Yes, what about—" "Excellent," Mr. Werner said, clapping his hands. "I knew we could count on you, Mr. Baker. We look forward to hearing from you about the state of affairs on the island. It should be interesting, to say the least. Now, All this blathering on has left my throat parched. I do think it's time for tea. Our secretary will show you out. It was lovely to meet you. Extremely upper management stood as one, bowed down at him, and then all the lights went out. Linus squeaked. Before he could begin to fumble in the dark, a light switched back on at the top of the wall. He blinked up at it. Mr. Werner stared down at him, a curious expression on his face. The others were already gone. Something else? Linus asked nervously. Mr. Werner said, "Beware, Mr. Baker." That was certainly ominous. Beware? Mr. Werner nodded. You must prepare yourself. I cannot stress enough how important this assignment is. Leave no detail out, no matter how small or inconsequential it may seem. Linus bristled. It was one thing to question his readiness, but it was something else entirely to question the thoroughness of his reports. Let's just say I have a vested interest in what you find, Mr. Werner said, ignoring Linus's spluttering indignation. It goes beyond mere inquisitiveness. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I don't like being disappointed, Mr. Baker. Please, don't disappoint me. Why this place? He asked rather helplessly. What brought this orphanage to your attention and requires the oversight of a caseworker? Has the master done something to... It's rather what he hasn't done, Mr. Werner said. His monthly reports are lacking, especially in the face of who his charges are. We need to know more, Mr. Baker. Order only works if there is complete transparency. If we can't have that, then we run the risk of chaos. Is there anything else? What? Yes, Good, Mr. Werner said. I wish you luck. I think you'll need it. And with that, the light went out again. Oh dear, Linus said. The golden lights on the floor lit up once more. Are you quite finished? A voice said near his ear. He absolutely did not scream, no matter the evidence to the contrary. Miss Bubblegum stood behind him, gum snapping. This way, Mr. Baker. She spun around, dress flaring at her knees, and marched toward the exit. Linus followed her quickly, only glancing over his shoulder once into the darkness. She waited for him just outside the chambers, tapping her foot with impatience. Linus was quite out of breath by the time he passed through the open door. He couldn't be sure what had just happened was anything more than a fever dream. He certainly felt feverish. It was possible Miss Bubblegum was a hallucination, conjured up by a previously undiagnosed illness. A very pushy hallucination, to be sure, as she thrust a thick folder into his hands, causing him to fumble and almost drop his briefcase.
Train ticket is inside, she said. In addition, you'll find a sealed envelope with the files you'll be needing. I don't know what it's about, and I don't care. I'm paid not to snoop, if you can believe that. You're not to open the envelope until you've stepped off the train at your final destination.
I think I need to sit down, Linus said weakly. She squinted at him.
Of course you can sit down. Just make sure you do it far away from here. Your train leaves at 7 tomorrow morning, don't be late. Extremely upper management will be most displeased if you're late.
I need to go back down to my desk and...
Absolutely not, Mr. Baker. I've been instructed to tell you that you are to exit the premises without delay. Speak to no one. I don't think that should be a problem for you, but it had to be said.
I have no idea what's going on, he said. I'm not even sure if I'm here.
Yes, Ms. Bubblegum said sympathetically. Sounds like quite the existential crisis. Perhaps consider having it somewhere else.
They were standing in front of the elevators. He hadn't even known they were moving. The doors slid open in front of him. Miss Bubblegum shoved him in and reached in to hit the button for the first floor. She stepped out of the elevator.
Thank you for visiting the offices of Extremely Upper Management, she said cheerfully. Have a fantastical day.
The doors slid shut before he could speak another word. It was still raining. He barely even noticed. One moment, he was standing in front of the department in charge of magical youth, and the next, he was on the stone path that led to his porch.
He didn't know how he'd gotten there, but that seemed to be the least of his worries. He was startled out of his daze when Mrs. Clapper called over to him.
"You're home early, Mr. Baker. Did you get sacked? Or perhaps you received terrible medical news and need time to reconcile with your bleak future?"
Smoke curled up around her bouffant from her pipe.
"I'm so sorry to hear that. You'll be missed terribly."
"Not dying," he managed to say.
"Oh, more's the pity, I suppose. So that only leaves getting sacked. You poor dear. How will you go on, especially in this economy? I suppose you'll have to sell your house and find a dismal apartment somewhere in the city."
She shook her head.
"You'll probably end up murdered. Crime is on the rise, you know."
"I didn't get sacked," she snorted.
"I don't believe you."
Linus sputtered. She sat forward on her rocker.
"You know, my grandson is looking for a personal secretary at his accounting firm. This could be your in, Mr. Baker. I do believe I've read stories that started exactly like that. Think about it. Your life is at its lowest this very moment, and you need to start fresh, which leads you to finding your true love. It practically writes itself."
"Good day, Mrs. Clapper," Linus cried as he stumbled up his steps.
"Think about it,"
she shouted after him.
"If all goes well, we could be family."
He slammed the door shut behind him. Calliope sat in her usual spot, tail twitching, seemingly unsurprised at his early return. Linus slumped against the door, his legs gave out, and he slid to the carpet. "You know," he told her, "I don't know if I had a very good day. No, I don't think I had a good day at all." Calliope, as was her wont, only purred. They stayed that way for a long time.